Excellent. Well, we have a lot of people who have been patiently waiting in our waiting room who are with us here already. So it's 11 here on a beautiful morning in our last full week of classes at the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. We go into our Thanksgiving break and then really the kind of end of semester. And so I'm really grateful to all of you who have joined us online. And I know from past experience that Harish, we will be having an even larger viewership as we record this seminar and post it online. So thank you all for joining at what I know can be a very busy time of the semester. And it's a real delight to have with us today Professor Harish Naraindas talking about something that is as topical as it has unfortunately been relevant at past historical junctures. And Harish is going to be bringing that, I think, critical but often overlooked emphasis on history to understand the challenges of COVID, particularly of vaccination against COVID. In some ways, here, at least in New England, we can have moments of living in this triumphant post-COVID world, and yet we know much better that this hubris is in some senses misplaced. And so I think learning from history serves us very well. Professor Naraindas comes to us today from New Delhi, the capital of India, and in particular from the campus of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, or JNU as it's popularly and affectionately known. Professor Naraindas is a professor of sociology at JNU and also an honorary professor at the Alfred Deakin Institute, from where he also has an honorary degree. He has been faculty at the University of Iowa, at the University of Heidelberg, at the University of Freiburg, and has worked for many years on the history of and sociology of science and medicine. I have learned a lot from reading his work, and I remain really awestruck and impressed by both the depth and thoughtfulness of his investigations, but also the wide range of topics that he has covered, including an epistemological history of tropical medicine, a comparative history of smallpox from the 18th to the 20th century. That's the work that I'm most familiar with because I'm also writing a book on vaccination against smallpox in China and India. And that's what Professor Naraindas will be speaking to us mostly based on today. But he's also written on pregnancy and childbirth, on spa medicine in Germany, on the creolisation of contemporary Ayurvedic medicine, and is working presently on a project on AyurGenomics and P4 medicine, on past life etiologies and therapeutic trance in German psychosomatic medicine. And I spent a year in Berlin a few years ago, and that kind of intersection of homeopathy, Ayurveda, and kind of a very large number of kind of alternate and complementary medical forms in Germany is something that's quite real and alive today. So Harish, I could go on for a very long time. I could talk about your co-edited volumes, your special issues, your many books, but I feel as if it would serve us better now to turn the floor to you, to just thank you for taking this time to join us today and to welcome you virtually, but hopefully at some point in person, to the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prerna, for that very generous introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to present at this forum. And I'm very happy to be here. I think let me just start by saying that we do some. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is going to be, in some senses, some kind of a summary of my talk. And it's, I've published something recently on the 1st of May. Why is this? I'm sorry, I'm not able to move my slides up and down.
You might want to try that button right on the bottom.
Oh, left. Yes, yeah, that's right.
That will go further. The other one will take you all the way back.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I published something on the 1st of May, 2020. So I'm not going to repeat what's here, and you all can read this. So today's talk is going to be more historical in nature, and which is, the thing is, we do have something called vaccine hesitancy. And but how do we understand? It's been, I think there's a lot has been written on it, and a lot continues to be written on this. But I'm going to, the title of my talk is this: Self-Care to Public Welfare, Smallpox Variolation to COVID Vaccination, from 1721 to 2021. The advent of vaccination in 1804 in India leads to a hiatus between care and welfare. Schulbred, the smallpox commissioner, bemoans the fact that the Indians' refusal to be vaccinated is because they have no concept of the public. The ostensible refusal may afford us a perspective on contemporary vaccine hesitancy and allow us to see the present as part of a trajectory that begins in England in 1721 with the import of variolation from the East. Variolation in India, signaled through Could's note of 1731, written to the Royal Society, is one act in a 5-act play that ensures public welfare through individual care. The other 4 acts, enacted when a person naturally contracts smallpox, sacralizes the patient as he becomes the repository of the smallpox deity. Premised on an alternative epistemology, it blurs the boundary between medicine and religion. While variolation mimics this sacralization, vaccination, the prototype prophylactic, disembeds the patient from a therapeutics of care and inaugurates a public. This leads to a transformation from sacralized cells and a cool regimen to state-imposed vaccination and an imagery of the kill. So that is the, that's roughly what the paper is going to be about. And I'm going to be primarily talking around these 2 little circles. I'm going to try and build the argument. I've given you an overview. And for those of you all who may not know, smallpox variolation as opposed to smallpox vaccination. Smallpox vaccination is actually the cowpox, which is the smallpox of the cow. And I think Jenner evidently, supposedly discovered it in 1796 and discovered that the cowpox actually acts as a prophylactic against smallpox. But smallpox variolation is like the current, say, the polio vaccine. And namely, you either give the killed version if it's an Oreo polio vaccine, or you give an attenuated version if it's an injectable. So the smallpox variolation is like that, namely that you actually, it's a real case of smallpox. You take a little bit of the pus from the pustule of a smallpox patient, usually a child, and you give it to another child. And this was evidently practiced in many parts of the world, supposedly in China, at least in the middle of the 16th century. And this is being then communicated to the Royal College of Physicians in England, at least from 1700 onwards. And then in 1718, I think Lady Mary Watley Montagu, I think she's the wife of the British ambassador in Turkey, discovers this in Istanbul and has either one of her children, either the son or the daughter, I'm not able to recall. I think she has one of her children vaccinated or variolated in Turkey in 1718. And then she writes about this to another friend of hers. And then in 1721, there's an epidemic in England. And I think 1721 is when there's an epidemic also in the US, which probably comes from England to the US, to New England. And in 1721, she persuades somebody called Charles Maitland. I think he's the same person who variolated a child in Turkey in 1718 to variolate the other child back in England in 1721. And then I think she brings this to the notice of the Princess of Wales. And then they try this out with prisoners in the Newgate prison. And then variolation is set on its way by the royal family. So this is, but the question is, what exactly is this variolation? And then subsequently in 1731, meanwhile, between 1700 and 1721, there's a lot of writing that comes to the Royal Society from many parts of the East, including, and around about the same time, or a bit earlier in 1706, I think Cotton Mather in the US is also made aware of this, supposedly from one of his slaves, who's a Libyan slave. So when this is published in 1721, I think in the Royal Society, I think he then confirms this by saying that he's also aware of it. And I think in the same year, variolation also starts in the US, if I'm not mistaken. Though I don't want you to hold me to ransom on the dates. But smallpox and a lot of the writing, I mean, I've been trying to review the writing in the last year or so, and a lot of the writing almost invariably focuses on the act of inoculation, whether you call it variolation or vaccination. And as you can see, the current COVID pandemic is also, there's a kind of an obsessive thing on the vaccine. The vaccine is seen to be the be all and end all of everything. And I don't want to dispute that. But the fact remains that when smallpox, the question that arises is what happens to people if they, and even now you can be vaccinated for COVID, but you can have breakthrough infections. And when you have a breakthrough infection, you can get COVID. Or you can get COVID because you haven't taken the vaccine, or the vaccine hasn't reached you, or the vaccine has not proved to be effective despite the fact that you've taken it. And when you do get it, what exactly then happens to you? And I think the same is the case with smallpox. What happens to the people who actually get the smallpox? And how are they treated? Are they treated at all? Or should we then presume that there is no treatment for smallpox? And the general presumption is that we all tend to write a history of the past from the present, which you're not supposed to do. And historians are usually good at doing that. They don't import the past with categories from the present. But I've often noticed that they sometimes fail to do this, especially when they're writing the history of science and the history of medicine, unless they've been specifically trained in science studies. And I'll demonstrate that in a moment. And I say this because they tend to, I think very often we operate with what I call a post-Pasteur view of the world. We presume there's a theory of infection and that the virus is the sole cause of disease and so on and so forth. And we tacitly, try as we may, tend to import these categories into the past. And one example of that is the entire focus is on the vaccine as far as the current pandemic is concerned. And the entire focus is also on the smallpox vaccine when we write a history of the smallpox. But smallpox variolation, when it was introduced into England in 1721, is being introduced as part of a therapeutic structure where doctors, especially university-trained doctors, have to account for the fact that they have to treat people who come down with smallpox. And this treatment is what I call a regimen. And this regimen is there for a long time. For example, if you look at Sydenham's writings in the 17th century, who is seen to be the father of English medicine, it turns out that there are two ways in which smallpox can be treated. One is called the cold regimen, the other is called the hot regimen. And evidently by the 17th century, the hot regimen has become commonplace. But both the cool regimen and the hot regimen supposedly come from the 10th century Arab physician called Rhazes. And I've read Sydenham, and I've actually seen his writings. And especially in his early writings, Sydenham virtually verbatim takes over what Rhazes has to say about how smallpox is to be treated. And this is from the 10th century. Where Rhazes gets his regimen from, I have no idea. And that's entirely moot. And so there's a particular kind of regimen, and the regimen is, and so when smallpox inoculation or variolation is introduced, it gets embedded in terms of this larger regimen. And then the English find that that smallpox variolation is not only being practiced in China or North Africa, it's also being practiced in India and especially in Bengal. And the first letter of the Royal Society is a little short note, just a page and a half, by Coult in 1731. And then subsequently is a more famous one by John Zephaniah Holwell in 1767. And Holwell is himself a physician, and he also was briefly the governor of Bengal. And he's also very well known for having survived the Black Hole. And he's also very well known for having written a book on Hinduism, which is used by Voltaire in his fight against the clerics. John Zephaniah Holwell is very famous. It's a 20-page tract called The Manner of Inoculating for the Smallpox in the East Indies. And that particular tract is actually divided into two halves. In one half, he's telling you how the smallpox variolation or inoculation is actually done in great and assiduous detail. And then having done that, in the next half of the other 10 pages or so, he then tells his audience and he tells the reader, I'm now going to explain to you the principles upon which the Brahmins act. So he's offering you a particular kind of theory behind the act of inoculation. And unfortunately, what happens is, almost all historians or anthropologists, whoever has read Holwell's text, and his text is quoted again and again, have entirely focused on the first 10 pages of his writing, namely on the act of smallpox inoculation. And they have completely left the theory behind the act out of the reckoning. They don't pay any attention to it. They don't do an exegesis of it. And they don't think it's important. Well, I think it's terribly important because that's what Holwell is saying, that he's primarily writing about smallpox inoculation in 1767, not to introduce inoculation into England. Is already available in England from 1721. But he's primarily interested in what he calls the cool regimen, which he wants to try and reintroduce. Even that is already known in England, but he wants to support it and sort of reintroduce it back into England in terms of ongoing debates in England on how exactly you should handle smallpox. And so what is this regimen? And the way it works in India, according to Holwell, is that smallpox usually happens in March and April. And March and April is called the smallpox season. And there's a particular deity called Sitala, which means the cool one. And she's the one who is worshipped during this particular time. And Holwell says that the tikadars or the inoculators go from village to village, usually by state subvention. And they're also paid for. I mean, people, including poor people, pay them a small amount of money for the act of variolating them. And they go from village to village, and there's an interdiction. And the interdiction is that all the children that they're going to variolate should abstain from fish, milk, and ghee, which are the staple of Bengali food, evidently in the 18th century, which is probably still the staple now, especially fish, milk, and ghee, clarified butter, and you're supposed to abstain from eating them for an entire month. And only if this abstinence is being put into play, the variolators will agree to inoculate the children. Otherwise, they will refuse to inoculate the children. So you first abstain, and then the inoculation act happens, which is Act 2. And after the inoculation happens, what happens is the patient is then bathed with cold water. Some water is left in earthen pots overnight. It becomes intensely cold. And then early in the morning, it's by sluicing, it's poured over the patient's head. And by cold bathing the patient, they do this till the fever comes on. Usually the fever comes on in about 3 days. And once the fever comes on, then you stop the cold bathing. And the idea is to fan the fever so that the coction begins. And there's a particular theory behind it. And the theory is that the body has a preternatural ferment inside. And this coction begins. And once the fever comes on, you stop the bathing. And after a few days, the pustules will come. And once the pustules begin to emerge on the skin, you restart the cold bathing until the pustules are completely filled. And I marked that here in the circle. And then along with the cold bathing, you must make sure that the patient is only given cold food. Cold food doesn't only mean cold in terms of temperature, but cold in terms of temperament based on a humoral theory. And then the patient also should be well ventilated. He should not be confined to a room and put under warm blankets, but he should be well ventilated, kept cool, given cold food, and then the cold bathing till the fever comes on. The fever comes on, the bathing stops. And when the pustules begin to fill, the cold bathing starts again. And when the pustules are then completely filled, then what happens is you take the thorn of a particular tree, and then it's very fine thorn, and the most prominent part of the pustules are punctured, and then the pus is taken out, and they are then taken in a calico rag, dipped in warm water and milk. And the exudate which comes out is then kept by the tikadars, by the verulators, and they use that to start the verulation next year, which means they don't use fresh pustule from another patient and give it to a child the same year. So this exudate is kept by them in calico rags and then is used the next year. So this is the rough, it's what I call a play in 5 acts. And as you can see, I've got these 2 circles: abstinence, what you do externally, abstinence, cold bathing and ventilating, and what you do internally is, there's you inoculate, and then you give the cold food, and then you evacuate. And what the body does is the body gets a fever, and then the pustules are filled. And once the pustules are evacuated, then the healing happens, and you're cured. And this also happens because there's an afterlife to the patient. Just like today, you have an afterlife to the COVID patient, or you have an afterlife even to the vaccinated COVID patients. We're all aware that there's an afterlife. I'll come to that in a moment. And the afterlife to the smallpox is that unless you do all these things, even if you don't die, things can go horribly wrong. You can get pitted, you can go blind, and a lot of other things can happen. So this is what the smallpox verulation is about. And this is what Holwell is describing. And then Holwell is saying, why is it the Brahmins do what they do? He's trying to explain this. I can't go into that today, but you can read my work on this if you're interested. And he's primarily trying to explain this in terms of an 18th century humoral theory in England, which is similar in many ways to 18th century humoral theory that you have in India and probably also in China. And so it's easy for him, given the similarity in the humoral theory between Galenic medicine and the kind of humoral theory that you have in Ayurveda, for him to actually go back and forth with a modicum of ease, which is no longer the case from after the middle of the 19th century. And the long and short is that the disease has a course, and we are, and you have to, and there's an internal preternatural ferment, and the fever is merely the sign of the body trying to evacuate itself. And any drug that you give is supposed to mimic the body's natural inclination to cure itself. And the way the body is trying to cure itself of that preternatural ferment which is inside it is by throwing out the poison upon the skin, which is in the form of the pustule. And so the idea of 18th century therapeutics is that therapeutic is supposed to mimic the recourse of the body. Mimicry is to follow an intimate movement. You're supposed to do what the body itself is trying to do rather than act contrary to the body. Now, so this is roughly the idea, and we have. And and this is what, in some senses, what we have with the COVID vaccination, which is also true of smallpox vaccination. And in the case of COVID vaccination, or any kind of vaccination, is you don't have any abstinence. Nobody is asking you to fast, either for a month or for a week or even for a few days. There are no interdicted articles of diet. Instead, you vaccinate. And here also you get a fever. And you handle the fever not by giving cool food or cold food, but by giving antipyretics. Usually you're asked to take a small paracetamol. And of course, there is some abridged version. Of course, when you take a paracetamol, you get a fever, you go on a low diet, and then you recover. If you don't die. And most people don't die, fortunately, and we do recover from this particular kind of vaccination. And I think this is what vaccination also does with smallpox from 1804 onwards. And I think the vaccination is different from verulation on several counts because it's cowpox. Smallpox, verulation is thought to be stamped out from the early part of the 19th century with the advent of vaccination, because smallpox variolation is seen to be dangerous. It's seen to be dangerous because it's the actual case of the smallpox. So by variolating somebody, you can actually set up an epidemic. While cowpox, which is the vaccination, since it's the pox of the cow, supposedly cannot be transmitted from patient to patient. So A, it's safe, and B, it supposedly produces a very mild case of the cowpox, which makes you immune to the smallpox. And because it produces a very mild case of the cowpox, you don't need to abstain from eating any food before or supposedly during, and then you will get a fever, and then you will recover. But then it turns out, but it isn't as simple as that. Now, when this happens, both in England and in India, but especially in India, but it's also in England, throughout the length and breadth of England, as we see today, people violently protest against vaccination. There are, I think in 1853, 1840 is the first act, 1853 is the next act. I think John Gibbs is probably writing in 1853. You have anti-vaccination leagues that are formed throughout the length and breadth of England. And similarly, there are people in India also protest against vaccination. And the way historians have usually written about this is that supposedly people protested against vaccination in India because of apathy, superstition, and ignorance. And this is in any case what the colonial government and the vaccine establishment usually put out. But it turns out that this is not true. I mean, this is not true because when vaccination was introduced in India in 1804, it turns out that the natives gave it a fair trial. And then they found that very often the vaccine had a very poor take rate. And the reason why it had a very poor take rate was the vaccine was brought from England, arm to arm, on the bodies of children in ships. I think it probably arrived in Bombay in 1804 or 1802, and it probably reaches Calcutta in 1804. Again, I don't want you to hold me to ransom on the dates exactly. And then the vaccine establishment is set up. But the inclement weather in the hot season, it just dies out. And which is why many vaccines, even today, you require a cold chain. And of course, we had no such thing called a cold chain in the early 19th century. So it became inert, it died out. So the state, on the one hand, was trying to ban variolation and promote vaccination. But the fact remained that vaccination had a very poor take rate. And because they had a very poor take rate, so on the one hand, the state said you don't need to fast, you don't need to follow any of the procedures that you had to follow when you were doing variolation, which is the same procedures you also did when you naturally caught the smallpox in the smallpox season. Instead, the state was offering vaccination free. The natives tried it, and then they started getting smallpox, despite the fact that they were vaccinated. And the reason being that it had a very poor take rate. So they resorted back to variolation. And when they resorted back to variolation, there was a ding-dong between the colonial state and the natives throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, where the attempt was to continuously to stamp out variolation as opposed to vaccination. And we had something very similar in England. I mean, people were trying to stamp out variolation and introduce vaccination also in 19th century England. And I think the same was the case in New England. But in England, I think is very well recorded. I'm more aware of the English history. And there we had the anti-vaccination leagues. And people supposedly protested against vaccination for various reasons. One is for civil liberty, as we are seeing in the US today. It's an infringement on your civil liberties. It's an infringement on your religious liberty. And people also protested by saying that it was ineffective. People protested saying that it was unsafe. People protested by saying that it was, and that it had led to what are called adverse effects. And people had, and somebody has made a, comparison between what happened in 1853, what happened in 1898, what happened in 2001, and what's happening in 2020 and 2021. And it turns out that all these things are similar, very similar, that what happens throughout the 19th century and what's happening today. there's an enormous amount of similarity, especially in terms of civil liberties and religious liberties, and also the fact that it's ineffective. And we know now that the vaccine is effective only, and there are various statistics depending on the vaccine. But, and in the 19th century, people said it was also unsanitary, it was polluting, and more importantly, that the smallpox vaccine actually led to the big pox, namely syphilis. And many of these 19th century concerns later all turned out to be true. I think if you go and read, if you just read a Wikipedia entry, and people are now willing to admit that it actually did lead to syphilis. It led to syphilis, erysipelas, post-vaccination encephalitis, and it led to tetanus. And a lot of people died because of the way the vaccine was done. And there are many other reasons why people protested also in India, because the variolation actually produced quite a number of pustules. And in the 5-act play that I outlined for you, what you can see here is that the variolation is actually solicited. And it's not only solicited by the populace, and not only are the variulators paid a small amount of money, but in India something else happens, namely the patient is sacralized. The patient is sacralized because the smallpox is seen to be a deity. The deity is both the source of the affliction and the cure for the affliction. And the deity has a sidekick, and the sidekick is called Jwarasud, namely fever. And so she comes with the sidekick and gives you the fever. But if you follow the regimen, then she will leave. So since the patient is sacralized and he becomes the repository of the deity, and the patient himself becomes the deity because the deity is inside him. And because he becomes the repository of the deity and he becomes the deity, in some senses, the patient himself is then worshipped. And every whim of his is attended to. And his care then becomes absolutely paramount. And his care then extends to the entire household. Not only is he given cool food, the entire household eats the same kind of food. Not only does the entire household eat the same food, the entire mohalla, the entire neighborhood might also eat the same kind of food if there's a particular patient with smallpox in a particular house. And then maybe your neighbors or maybe people from the next neighborhood, they'll cook food and bring it for you. So there's a particular way in which this particular kind of sacralization happens. And this particular sacralization then means that you have a particular kind of care regimen. And if this care regimen is then carefully attended to, then what happens is, and as people have pointed out, both in 18th century England and in 18th century India, and Holwell himself says that, and right up till 1860, vaccination commissioners have repeatedly said this in their reports, by saying that if you follow all these protocols, that the variolation setting up a natural epidemic is very, very remote. And the number of people dying of it is very, very, very small, and it's perfectly safe. And this kind of sacralization means that something entirely different is happening, and you can ensure public welfare through individual care. But what vaccination does something entirely different. It takes away this individual care completely. The state imposes the vaccination. And by imposing vaccination, then people become recalcitrant and they begin to protest. And then you then go to a particular kind of imagery of war. And this imagery of war later, as I point out, so this is the smallpox deity. The smallpox deity is then converted into a demon in 1973. And then you wage war against the smallpox and you try to eradicate smallpox. And then, so I think I'll stop here. I suspect Prerna has come online, and she told me if she comes online, my half an hour is up. So I think I'll stop there and I'll take questions. I mean, whatever it is, when we probably say more things during Q&A. Thank you, Prerna.
Thank you, Harish. That was a kind of really interesting deep dive into history. And what I thought I would do is actually drawing on your own kind of popular writing is maybe pull us out just a little bit based on this kind of rich evidence and tapestry that you have kind of given us. If you'd like to stop sharing the screen, Harish, there's a little button there that would allow you to do that, and then we'd be able to see you. That's great. So I was just kind of, thinking a little bit as we're, so I had a few reflections and a few questions, which is, I was thinking about like where we are in our stage of COVID vaccines. And I think to kind of really put some of this rich historical context that you've given us into conversation with what's happening in the contemporary period with COVID. And so in some ways, obviously where we are varies based on where we are physically. And so obviously things in India are very different to here in the US. I think it's pretty much the case now that you are eligible. I think it was just this morning that the FDA said that all Americans above the age of 18, all residents of America are eligible for a booster shot. My daughter just got her first COVID vaccine a few weeks ago. So we're in this kind of, third booster shot, children getting COVID vaccines. Things are obviously different in India. And so when I'm thinking about the trajectory of the kind of smallpox, because smallpox, as you pointed out, is one of the most infectious diseases. It's one of history's greatest killers, but it's also the site of our most triumphant achievement in public health, in that it's the only human disease that we've been able to eradicate. And therefore, I think your work is particularly interesting and pertinent because it is on this, the most successful vaccination campaign that we have seen. And the interesting thing is that many of us have seen it in the course of our lifetimes. I mean, many people born in India before 1979 or before 1980 would actually have received a smallpox vaccine, probably not a booster shot as eradication happened. So to me, those are some of the kinds of reasons for why I think COVID and the smallpox vaccination have important lessons to offer. And yet this question of, where are we? Are we in the kind of, eventually smallpox eradication? And so, so I'll back out a little to say, well, there are 2 or 3 kind of key similarities and differences between COVID and smallpox. And I want to kind of just bring out as a political scientist what I see as some of the challenges to this kind of desideratum of universal vaccination against COVID, with the caveat that, of course, there will be breakthrough infections, but that we hope they will not be as dangerous and will be much milder than it would be if you got COVID as an unvaccinated adult or child. So one is that smallpox vaccines were vaccines mostly administered during childhood. And I think this is the kind of second stage of vaccine hesitancy or of vaccine convincing, if you want to be more optimistic, that is going to happen, while COVID, for the most part, involves vaccination up until now in most parts of the world of adults. And so when you're talking about this regimen of care of the patient, of who is being variolated, in many instances, these are children. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit to what does it mean for smallpox to have been a primarily childhood disease and for COVID to be in some ways a more democratic disease that attacks, in fact, the old more and is more dangerous for them, and whether that has any ramifications for hesitancy. The other broader questions as a political scientist is I think it's important to separate this question, and you very nicely brought it out about, a lot of the hesitancy around the smallpox vaccine was because it was actually ineffective early on. The take rates, as you said, were quite low. And so to what extent if I had to kind of ask you about COVID hesitancy in India, would you be able to talk a little bit about how much, are there parallels with the reasons for the smallpox vaccine hesitancy? Is it because these are vaccines that people have some concerns over? And as you rightly point out, for this first ever vaccine against smallpox, many of these concerns turned out to be borne out by evidence, is that they were linked to tetanus and potentially syphilis. So I'm trying to kind of understand, because to me, the key thing is, in order to be able to reach that desideratum, we need to kind of be able to parse out what are the reasons for COVID hesitancy, and to what extent are those paralleled by smallpox, such that history might be able to teach us some lessons about it. And so one was, this point about, are there concerns about the efficacy of the vaccine as there were for smallpox? You didn't mention it today because I think you were in a different historical time period, but in your more popular writing, you have spoken about the way in which the vaccine is provided, especially by health workers and frontline kind of service providers, the street level bureaucrats, we might call them. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you see the kind of COVID, like who are at the front lines of COVID vaccination in India. And you have written about how important it was for the WHO to have this really committed set of Indian vaccinators, the esprit de corps that brought them together. And so can you speak a little bit about perhaps what is the role of the frontline health provider? What are the mechanisms of provision through which the COVID vaccine is spreading? Is that similar to or different from smallpox? Are there lessons about the motivation of service personnel that we can take from smallpox and bring it to COVID? And finally, and I'll stop there because I realize this is a lot, is that much of your work, when you talk about the fact that a smallpox patient was much more than a patient. There was this sacralization. They were almost a kind of deity, or they were being visited by the deity themselves. Smallpox was embedded with the vaccine when was, the reason why the colonial states' attempts to provide the vaccine were countered with hesitancy and often opposition, as they were in other parts of the world too, was because they were seen as a break from the traditional regimen. And I've read a few newspaper articles. There was a long article in the Hindu a few weeks ago about how some of the reasons for the hesitancy around the COVID vaccines comes from the hinterland, comes also more from areas with larger scheduled tribe, indigenous, Aboriginal populations. There was also I've been reading some interesting things about, the deities that are being co-opted around COVID. You have written quite interestingly about the use of paper mache masks. I forget what it is. Is it the chow masks that are used and how creatively they are being used? And so this question of, how do we address vaccine hesitancy? To what extent is this a hesitancy that arises from perhaps justified concerns about the efficacy and safety of the technology? To what extent is this an issue of the motivation of frontline service providers? To what extent is this a kind of vaccine being seen as a rupture and a kind of repudiation of existing ways of understanding disease and ways of being, such that, the kind of sacralization of the vaccine or of the use of kind of traditional performances and culture and arts can be used? And so, the kind of overall question is really about trying to kind of help us through the lens of the past understand both the reasons for the nature of the hesitation around the COVID vaccine in India, and also how can we then begin to take those lessons from the past, as the title of this seminar suggests, to kind of try to address some of those concerns around the vaccine. So maybe if you could just take a few minutes to kind of get us started on that, as I begin to collate some of the questions in the chat, would be great.
Okay, Prerna, thanks a ton. I mean, that's quite a lot to process, but let me see where I can start with. But thank you very much for all those comments and questions. I don't know where exactly to start, but I think what I'd like to say is that as far as the global South is concerned, and if we take India as an exemplary instance of that, I think it's very important that we don't do in the 21st century what we did in the past. Namely, if people are saying no to the vaccine, the first thing that we tend to do is we put it down to three things: what's called apathy, ignorance, and superstition. And I think that's not very helpful. It's not very helpful when so-called, within quotes, tribal people, as you said, are, and they say no to vaccine. It's not because either apathy or ignorance or superstition. The second is, it's very important, although I have used the word sacralization, it's very important that any kind of vaccine hesitancy is not reduced to faith and religion, because that's the usual trope through which the global South is seen, India in particular, that any kind of vaccine hesitancy should be based in some kind of a religious, underpinning. But what I'm trying to propose in this talk, in all my writing, and probably that didn't come out very well, and which is why I'm invoking Hallwell's text, is that there could be what are called alternative epistemologies. People could have other theories of medicine. They could have other theories of causality and other ways of understanding bodies, disease, illness, and death. And people might be saying no because of that. So I think this is what, and that's the argument. And the argument says, so here is a Scotsman who is himself a physician in the 18th century, and he's trying to tell you how variolation was practiced in India in the 18th century. And he's saying that variolation is only one act in a 5-act play. It's one act in a 5-act play because it's embedded in a larger, what I call a theory of therapeutics. And in that theory of therapeutics is based on 18th century humoral medicine. And 18th century humoral medicine, whether it's Galenic or Ayurveda, are similar, not identical by any stretch of imagination. They are similar and comparable. And because they are similar and comparable, he's saying that 18th century humoral medicine primarily has a particular kind of therapeutic structure. And when variolation is introduced into England in 1721, it gets embedded in an already pre-given therapeutic structure. And it's very important that we pay attention to the episteme, that larger episteme in which inoculation is being embedded. But unfortunately, when historians write about the 18th century, they don't do that. They focus entirely on the inoculation. And they are completely obsessed only with the pure act of inoculation, and they don't pay attention to the fact that the inoculation or variolation is embedded within a larger theoretical framework. And or they reduce, like David Arnold is a good example. He reduces this larger theoretical framework to the pole of religion and ritual. So he says, oh, the reason why people protested against vaccination is because vaccination has no puja and ritual to attend it. And because it has no puja, it has no ritual, it has no deity, so people railed against vaccination. And I think this is a gross misreading of the past, which means all that you're saying is that natives either have a heart through which they can lament, or they have a hand through which they can practice something called inoculation, which they supposedly discovered by accident. And people, by some kind of unbridled empiricism, as it's called. But what natives don't have is a head, which means they don't have a theory, right? I mean, so you'll either talk about their heart or you'll talk about the hand, but the head is missing. And while my effort is to reintroduce the fact that natives also have a head, there's a particular kind of theoretical scaffolding within which this inoculation is to be placed. But it so happens that this theoretical scaffolding is also coeval with that understanding of what is called religion. Now, this word religion again is completely problematic word because, at least as far as anthropology is concerned, I've tried to argue elsewhere that by religion, in modern writing, when we mean religion, we mean Protestantism. It doesn't mean anything else. And we should be very clear about that. And I think, so it is, but this is not the way, this is not what religion means everywhere in the world. Right. And but in other parts of the world, Protestantism is used as the yardstick. Now, what happens is, so in India, there is a particular kind of theoretical scaffolding. And in that theoretical scaffolding, you also have a smallpox deity. It turns out that what you do to the deity is what you do to the patient, not the other way around. It's not that you do to the patient what you do to the deity, but what you do to the deity is what you do to the patient, because the patient is the deity, where the deity gets into him, right? So, and that what you do to the patient is given to you in medical textbooks, right? And not the inoculation itself, but the rest of the paraphernalia and the rest of the play, so to speak, are there in the medical textbooks. But you don't pay attention to them. You don't think that theory is important. But you're just reducing this entirely to the pole of ritual and religion, or to apathy, ignorance, and superstition. And I want to try and rescue this. So I'm trying to offer you a reading by saying, if you read the past in this particular way, it's not helpful. And then if you are going to make the same mistake again in the present, again, it's not going to be helpful.
This is really wonderful. Thank you so much for saying that. I loved the way that you said it, that natives are supposed to have a heart and a hand, but not a head. And I think what I have really appreciated about your work is that even though is the kind of nuance on some of the kind of subaltern studies scholars such as David Arnold to say that the smallpox vaccine was not just rejected because of religion, but because in some ways it was a kind of an alternate, and at that point, just an alternate episteme, and really a kind of epistemological understanding of the disease that was different. And so this is, to me, this is, thank you. I mean, I had a few other questions, but I wanted to just kind of come in to say that how important that point is, and in a sense, how relevant it is, because in some ways, even though that is the colonial state, and what in a way Arnold is basing his comments on are colonial archives. In some ways, the kind of post-colonial state, the democratic Indian state, continued with this way of kind of seeing the population, and you see similar assessments. And that's why I think your recasting is so important today, is that you see again and again in reports of the Community Development Act, of a number of other kind of government documents, you see that same vein of really attributing any kind of opposition to these kinds of, modernizing schemes as rooted in apathy, as rooted in superstition and a lack of understanding. And I think the dangerous part there in particular is that can often serve as the subtext for the justification of coercive measures, for the introduction of kind of compulsory vaccination acts, or worse. I mean, we know even in the history of the smallpox eradication campaign in India, there are many instances of kind of just outright coercion, particularly with more marginalized communities, such as indigenous populations. And so I just wanted to kind of jump in to say how important it is, this point that you're saying, that one very critical thing to learn is to kind of really guard against these all too familiar and easy ways of recasting or of interpreting hesitancy as rooted in this kind of ignorance and apathy. So I think that point is really well taken. And I think also your point about the theory, I think that's quite fascinating. And I think, here I wanted to kind of ask you a question and then really maybe lead it on to a question by Rachel Brulé, who is a political scientist at Boston University and is along with Professor Varshni and Professor Davies on the kind of Brown Harvard MIT Center for the kind of South Asia seminar that I was speaking to you about today. So I'll bring in Rachel's question, but I'll begin by kind of just saying, I think this point that you're mentioning, which again, I think is part of this larger point that natives, and here when we talk about natives, we're talking about Indians in the case of the colonial context, but really kind of, Indian citizens in the post-colonial context also have a head, or to what extent can these reasons for hesitancy be actually rooted in things other than apathy? And so in my work, I've been trying to compare the smallpox eradication campaigns, but also more historically in the 19th century efforts to kind of counter the disease through the beginning of vaccines in China and India. And so what's so interesting in this is that, so Jenner is supposed to have invented the vaccine, as you rightly pointed out. He's building on these centuries old traditions that are rooted in India and China of variolation. That's where the word tika comes from. But much of the hesitation, and this is the point I think that's so important, is not to kind of fall into this apathy, ignorance kind of way of thinking about it, is much of the opposition in my reading to Jenner from within Europe is that he doesn't really have much of a theory for how it is that the smallpox vaccine works. because it's an observational insight that cowpox maidens are some of the most desirable brides in the UK. And the reason why they're so desirable is because unlike many other women, their faces are not pitted with smallpox scars. And the reason they don't have smallpox scars is because they work with cows that have given them cowpox, which is quite a nasty disease if you're a cow, but very benign if you're a human. And so, that's an observational link that leads to the invention of the vaccine, but there's no theory behind it. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind too, is that much of the hesitancy around that world's first vaccine was because there were alternate theories, and the vaccine did not come with a theory. And so in China, through a reading of medical manuals, I find that a lot of the reason why hesitancy is countered is because vaccine is sinicized and brought into a theory of fetal toxins and into the meridian theory of acupuncture. And so the vaccine is linked to acupuncture and is given, in a sense, a theoretical scaffolding, to use your term, that is missing from its originator, Jenner. And so I think getting to the COVID vaccine and Rachel's question, to me, it's interesting, the moment that we are in India, the fact that we have actually like an Ayush ministry. I don't know to what extent, again, Ayurveda is one among many, and Unani and Ayurveda themselves are terms that, brutalize in some ways so much heterogeneity within these forms of medicine. But there is a way in which there seems to be a greater attention, at least through the present regime, on this kind of, Ayurveda. And so to what extent is there an opportunity to kind of embed the COVID vaccine in a kind of theoretical epistemology? I was just kind of curious about that. But before I kind of turn it back to you, there is, I think Rachel has a more precise and perhaps more articulate question about, I think, a related issue about the state and religion. So I know we said we wouldn't do it this way, but I almost wonder, Rachel, if you wouldn't mind just kind of coming in to ask your question, because I do think it's kind of very much on point.
I'm not sure she's there.
Oh, is she not? Okay. Well, in that case, maybe I will just recast her question, which is that she says that, what can we learn from the past success in terms of this one act of the 5-act play of therapeutics, right? So is there a way in which, from what I understood Rachel's question as she typed it out in the text, is there a way in which you collect, so COVID vaccine is in some ways right now a play in 3 acts for us in the US. Our first act was the first vaccine, the second was the second shot, and now we're in the precipice of this third kind of booster shot act. And so does this way of thinking about the vaccine, the vaccine and these acts, does it make sense for the present period? I thought that, Rachel's kind of asking, kind of relating it exactly to this point about the acts and the 5 acts, is like, what other acts, apart from kind of queuing up and getting our boosters, is there another kind of set of acts that we can kind of put together? Does Ayurveda give us, and the present regime's focus on Ayurveda, give us some pointers towards these acts? Would that be helpful? I'll stop, but sorry, this was slightly rambly, and I think Rachel's was, but I think just thoughts and questions provoked by, I think this is a very important point about the lessons that we need to learn from history in terms of what not to do.
And thank you, Prerna. That was really articulate. I'll add just one last point, which is just about power there. So to what extent, to me, part of the challenge that Harish, you brought up, and Prerna as well, that I think the coercive use of the state, especially against marginalized populations who are seen as backward or superstitious or kind of, unable to process the knowledge the state is trying to convey, is really concerning. But I wonder, is there a way bringing religion in just adds another layer of coercion, or is that actually a way about democratizing, access to knowledge? But I'll stop there. So.
I'm sorry, thank you very much, both Rachel and Prerna. And Rachel, I'm going to start with the last part of what you're saying. I think the argument that I'm trying to make is what I'm trying to elucidate is that the coercive nature of vaccination and statecraft should be derived from the episteme. I think that's the argument that I'm trying to put across. Namely, that there's an epistemic shift between variolation and vaccination. And this epistemic shift automatically makes vaccination a state-imposed activity. And if we don't pay attention to the episteme, but instead of that, if we catch hold of the shiny end of the stick, namely, if we start from politics and we start from statecraft and don't pay attention to the medical episteme that underpins it, then we may not get very far. So that's the argument that I'm trying to articulate, because the variolation is embedded in a particular kind of humoral theory. And that humoral theory means that diseases have a course, seasons have a course, and the fever is seen very differently. For example, if you read Foucault, he will tell you the etymology of the word fever comes from February. It means ritually expel from a house the shades of the dead. And it means the fever is something that is purificatory in intention. The fever is not the disease, it's merely a symptom of the body trying to get well. And the fever of the smallpox patient is a body trying to get well. And the way it's trying to get well is by throwing out the poison on the skin in the form of pustules. And those pustules have to be evacuated. And when you evacuate it, the variolators come and evacuate it, because that's the last act in the play of 5 acts. And when they do that, they automatically get the matter for the next year's variolation. Now, in this epistemic shift, all this abstinence, cool regimen all goes out of the window. What you're getting now is cowpox instead of smallpox. Cowpox produces a very small number of local pustules. And there are no variolators who come as a 5th act in the play of 5 acts to try and open it with a thorn, because the state says all this is not necessary. You don't need to fast. You don't need to do anything at all. You don't need to have cold bathing. You don't need to have cold food. So instead, what the state is saying is that I'm going to give you money. I'll give you 8 annas. On the 8th day, you kindly bring your child back. And when you bring your child back, I want to see whether the vaccine is taken. And if the vaccine is taken, I'll give you 50 naya paise, or 8 annas as it's called. But more importantly, it says, then I want to take your child to the next village. And then the parents are petrified. They don't want to bring the child to the vaccine depot, for example, in Calcutta or in a rural village, because they feel that their child is going to be abducted by the state and taken to the next village. And unfortunately, this new episteme requires you to abduct the child and take it to the next village, because that's the only way the vaccine can be kept up from one body to another body on the arms of children. Which means there's a complete radical turnaround where the state becomes the main player, and it's giving you money to get vaccinated, it's giving you money to come back, and then it's paying you a certain amount of money, because no child can go unaccompanied by the mother or some other relative. So then the state has to give the vaccinator 5 rupees to be paid to the parents. And usually then upper class or upper caste children in India will never allow their children to be taken to the next village. And then, so there's another reason why people are then protesting against vaccination as opposed to variolation. So what I'm inviting all of you all to think about is that we need to pay attention to the medical episteme that underpins statecraft. And if we do not pay attention to the medical episteme that underpins it, then we might not be able to get the full picture. I mean, that's the argument. I don't know, I can say more, and by the time you come to the 1970s, the deity completely makes an exit. We have a new way of articulating it, namely the smallpox deity is converted into smallpox demon. What is what I call agent pox. And you have a new way. I've written about this. I don't want to repeat myself. but something entirely new happens. And where you begin to wage war. You begin to wage war in the sense you want to try and unearth every case of smallpox by what are called search and protocol methods, which we are doing now with COVID. And then you want to contain it, and then you want to quarantine people, and then when you have a vaccine, then you give them a vaccine. So I don't know if I'm making sense, Rachel, but this is what I'm trying to articulate. That we need to pay attention to that, and religion comes in because there's a blurred boundary in the older system, especially in India. There's a way in which everything gets anthropomorphized. You have a disease, and that disease will have a deity. But then it's also the same, and this is what Ludwig Fleck is saying in 1935. But the virus is nothing but the devil reincarnate. The virus is also an act of anthropomorphism. And he says the virus is nothing but the devil reincarnate. What you're now doing is you're hypostatizing the virus. You're operating with a new episteme, especially from 1898 onwards, namely what is called causal specificity. All diseases are ideally supposed to have a single cause, and all therapies are supposed to have, a single kind of cure, where the vaccine is a very prime example of this. So COVID is caused by a virus, and the vaccine is the prophylactic against COVID. But what happens if you actually get the COVID? And then this is what I've put in this, I call what is called immediate adverse event. So one of the immediate adverse events, and then there are extended adverse events. You have people get COVID and then they are suffering for the next 6 months. So for example, one of the things people are suffering from post-vaccination, not only from post-COVID. So you can be vaccinated from COVID, and a lot of women now have menstrual disorders. So what are we going to do with all the women who are going to have menstrual disorders and have menstrual disorders because of the vaccination? So one of the reasons why people are protesting against vaccination in the 20th century or 21st century are for similar reasons that they had in the 19th century. Then people said it leads to tetanus. Tetanus in the 19th century meant something entirely different from what it means now, but we won't go into that. And that people said you're getting the big pox, namely syphilis, which is now admitted to. And now people are also protesting because they feel that we don't know what the adverse effects of the COVID vaccination are. It's an experiment, and that experiment has been compressed in time. And because it's been compressed in time, they're all experimental subjects. So we don't know what's going to happen to us. Your sense of misgiving comes from the fact that apart from the fact that the COVID is bad, but even the vaccinating you for COVID can lead to what is called immediate adverse events and extended adverse events. And those extended adverse events are something we don't know. Something can happen to you a year later, something can happen to you 2 years later. And all these misgivings are something that we can't afford to poo-poo them. We can't poo-poo them, we need to take them on board. Because if you poo-poo them, that's exactly what you did in the 19th century. That's exactly what you did in the earlier part of the 20th century. And if you continue to do that, there will continue to be what's called vaccine hesitancy.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Did you want to finish your point?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I think these are really important points. I would, Rachel, if you wanted to come in again, I'm happy to. Ashu, I noticed that you unmuted yourself. Did you want to come in with something? I had a.
Yeah. This is not my field, but I'm reminded of the presentation was so remarkable in laying out alternative epistemologies, and especially the metaphor of head, heart, and hand, which was really very evocative. As I heard Harish, I was reminded of a chapter in and a paper given to this seminar long ago by Nicholas Dirks on hook swinging. And I'll just lay it out for you. And I don't know, this is a sort of stream of consciousness kind of remark. I don't know what to make of it. Perhaps you'll say something. So the hook swinging chapter of Castes of Mind in Nicholas Dirks is about his discovery in Madras archives files, a file that was suppressed by the British administrators. But this is a file which says that to please rain gods, some of the lower caste individuals were hook swung. So hooks were put through their bodies, and they were hook swung so that rains could come. And the British administrator was very upset with this savage practice, and recruited a doctor who was visiting Madras from Yale University, who had gone through a degree in medicine, and was, for some reason, Yale had an old connection with Madras, as we know now. So he was in Madras, and so the British administrator recruited this doctor from Yale to examine this body which was hook swung. And that's what Dirks discovered in the files. And the file said, the doctor's testimony to the district magistrate or collector is that everything that he has learned in the School of Medicine would suggest that this body that he just examined should be either deeply in pain or close to death, but he can testify that it's neither. And he would like to understand what kind of knowledge system would explain to him why this hook swung body is in a what he called a not very unhealthy condition. Even though he would have thought it would be close to death or would be seriously injured and seriously in pain. And then the file was suppressed, and the district magistrate did not want this file, this assessment to be known, and so the claim that Dirks was making was a Foucauldian point, that power was used to suppress an alternative form of knowledge, and modern knowledge was then imposed on the community, and hook swinging as a practice was outlawed. Though there was no evidence that it was doing the kind of damage that it was supposed to. And on the same grounds that this is there's a savage practice, people's hearts are involved, and in this case, not hand, the body is involved. There is no head being deployed here. So as you can see, I should stop here because this is becoming too rambling an account, but I was just reminded of this remarkable chapter that was first presented at this seminar some 10 years ago in another incarnation. Do you have any comments on, you would probably know that very well. Do you have any comments on the hook swinging episode in British Madras history?
Ashutosh, I'm from Madras myself.
I see.
But just by coincidence. But I'm afraid I haven't read this chapter. I haven't read this book by, I think, Nicholas Dirks, but I can see. But the way I'd like to answer, I'm very glad you posed this question. But it'll be the way to answer this question is the way I'd like to try and come to this question is, well, I'm glad to hear that this has been suppressed, but it's now come to light. I don't know what kind of alternative medical episteme in which this is based. It could be very well based in some alternative medical episteme, but I'm reminded of Mohoram,
yeah,
right, and what is called self-flagellation.
Right.
So my answer to this is when Nicholas Dirks is writing about hook swinging, say in 18th or 17th century Tamil Nadu, it might be interesting and fruitful. And this is the kind of thing we don't do. We don't do this, and we work in silos. And the way we work in silos is, we have a department of South Asian studies, and all the work is on South Asia. But for example, it might be interesting to compare that to other modes of self-flagellation that happen even today in Mohram. But that's not good enough. That is still in South Asia. But you might want to compare that to other modes of self-flagellation that happens in European Christendom. Right? I mean, so for example, if you go to Girona, which is not far from Dali's birthplace in Spain, and I think even till recently, you had modes of self-flagellation. And the self-flagellation is as true of Catholic Europe as it is of Mohram, as it is of hook swinging in other parts of the world. So if you put all this in the same canvas to see why is it that, self-flagellation by Catholics was being countenanced maybe as late as the 18th century, 19th century, even in the early part of the 20th century, and how did they survive it? And how did doctors in early 20th century Spain see self-flagellation? Or, for example, when the Anglicans were looking at hook swinging in Tamil Nadu in the 18th century, how were these Anglicans looking at their fellow Catholics doing self-flagellation in Spain in the 18th century? Right? So if you do this comparatively, and if you put both on the same canvas, which we normally don't do, then we might have a very different reading of this hook swinging. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Yes. So, and unfortunately, we don't do that. We don't do that, and we don't do that because, that's also because the Anglo-European world is not the object of inquiry for people in the global South. I mean, as I've said this many times, I think I tell people that if you produce 50 monographs of people from the global South who've written on the global North, then I'll take them to dinner for the rest of their lives. Right? And while you probably have, 500,000, 500,000 the other way around. The reason why I say this is then you'll have a different kind of reading. It's probably hook swinging is happening in Europe too, at the same time. And so can we put the two together? And if we put the two together, we might be able to produce another kind of reading, apart from the reading that you just said about imposing power to stamp out this, and the same and the other way. And I think I've actually said this elsewhere in part of my writing in my thesis, which I haven't published, is smallpox is, I call this soliciting the pox. So it's possible to argue that smallpox variolation, the way it is understood in India, is a way of committing suicide. It's a kind of self-killing. I mean, you're actively soliciting the pox, you're paying for it, while supposedly the state is offering you vaccination, which is supposedly safer from 1804 onwards, free, and you're not willing to take it. And this is what the colonial government is saying. It's saying, here we are offering the natives vaccination free of charge. They are not willing to take it. Instead, they are actually willing to pay their tikadars money and soliciting the pox, which is actually dangerous for them. Which means it's possible to argue that the natives are trying to commit suicide. Right? So it's a mode of self-killing. And it is a mode of self-killing. You can also call it a particular mode of witchcraft. But it's a mode of self-killing primarily because it's embedded in an epistemic and therapeutic structure. And interestingly enough, that same therapeutic structure obtains in 18th century England. It's the same. I mean, the cool regimen is as prevalent in 18th century England as it is in Bengal. Because the cool regimen in Sydenham actually comes from a 10th century Arab physician. And it's been there for an entire millennium in England. Unfortunately, again, when historians write about the 18th century, they leave out the theory. When I said the head is missing, it's not only the head is missing in India, but the head is missing in the way you write history. And they think that this theory is all, some mumbo jumbo. And the real theory is what we have in the present. And all theories that we have in the past really is not theory, but something that we've surpassed.
No, thank you.
Yeah, it's not helpful at all.
Those are very helpful. I think this point, I think that you've really kind of brought to the fore, and as Professor Varshney Ashu said, this is a kind of unusual, in a way, vantage point, which we don't usually have in the seminar series, this point about alternate epistemologies, alternate theories, and to take them seriously. And in a lot of my work, there is a statistical association, by no means causal, just observational, that there is a lot of, so there's a very high association pre-COVID. So vaccine hesitancy, I think this is another thing, is that vaccine hesitancy was not born with COVID. Vaccine hesitancy was born with vaccines. And I think that is something that you have kind of really alerted us to, is that there have been mobilizations against vaccines from the moment the world's first vaccine was attempted to be publicly disseminated. I think in the US, it's really interesting that there is this association between hesitancy towards the MMR, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, which was the main site of vaccine hesitancy, and belief in what are called, somewhat paradoxically, complementary and alternate medicine. So in the US, I guess the equivalent of Ayush is called CAM. And New England and California, the kinds are, often centers of these kinds of CAM medicines. And there is an association between those who kind of profess a belief in these CAM. And again, this is a wide church for everything from, homeopathy to chamomile tea at bedtime, to acupuncture, to yoga, to chiropractic, to Reiki, to pranic healing, to pranayam. And so there is this association between a belief in these practices and a hesitancy towards vaccines. But I think your point about what is mumbo jumbo and what is not, I mean, I can't help but think, what do we call misinformation? The fact that the CDC for so many months here in the US told us we did not need to wear masks because there was nothing preventing us. And so, if you just look at that point in time, what is a kind of hoax theory, and you have East Asians being attacked for wearing masks on public transport in big cities in the US, because, the CDC is scientifically telling us that masks are not necessary. And I also go back to your point about the fever, to interestingly now, for those of us who with kids, which is quite different from the way that I think our parents brought us up. My pediatrician here in kind of, New England tells me that I should not be giving my daughter a kind of paracetamol unless her fever is above 101, because below that, by giving a paracetamol or a fever reducer, you're actually impeding with the body's natural ability to be able to kind of fight fevers. And in some ways, this is not very different from what an Ayurvedic practitioner would tell you. So, I think you've really kind of brought very richly in this kind of conversation with Ashu too, this point about what is alternate, what is mainstream, what is mumbo jumbo, what is science, and kind of, bring a historian's perspective to that. Also in the US, the fact that, much of what we consider science is kind of born on kind of dirty skeletons of things like the Tuskegee trials and many others that, were, so there's reason for hesitancy, and that I think is not just to do with the heart, but to do with the head and with alternate ways of thinking, and to be able to respect that. I want to kind of give the last voice to a question that has come in from the audience. So far, I have called on people here who have been kind of involved in our community. So Grace, I'm going to request you if you could just unmute, and we have Vinay Brandon, and if you could just very briefly introduce yourself. I'm very mindful of the hour, Harish. We just have a few minutes, but if you might be able to just answer Vinay's, I think, quite interesting and related question that he has put in the chat. So Vinay, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you for picking up my question. Professor Naraindas knows me well. I'm a student of his. So this is my question. I'll just put it in the chat box as well, or I'll just read it out. So it is basically, sir, that can care regimens be seen to somehow work simultaneously with mass vaccination programs at the level of injecting mass disciplines? And we were barraged with a steady stream of folk theories, good practices, healthy habits at the dawn of the COVID contagion spread, which confronted the biomedical and state regulatory complex. These practices were actively encouraged as a complement while we waited for scientists and pharma companies to churn out an effective vaccine program, both tested and then disseminate. So Could this be seen as a masked placebo effect while we wait for clinical trials to furnish reliable vaccines? And hence, is it functional to the project of scientific rescue within vaccination? Thank you.
So Vinay, if I've understood you right, let me quickly try and rehearse what you're saying. You want to know whether the care regimen can work in tandem with vaccination, one, or B, the care regimen which was put into place before the vaccine came on the scene was some kind of a mass placebo till we waited for the vaccine, right?
Yes, very much. Could it work epistemically in conjunction with the unknown? Yes.
Yes, I mean, so as you can see, I mean, the second contradicts the first, so to speak. I mean, at least that's the way I understand it. If it's a placebo, then what we were doing is we're simply waiting for the real thing to come along. The real deal is the vaccine. But, you know, it's not a, I mean, I think the first is the care regimen in the sense is still there. I don't think it's, you know, people, for example, people began to consume all kinds of vitamins and zinc. And the amount of, I've just looked at the statistics, the amount of money that people have spent, say in India, consuming vitamins and zinc has really gone through the roof. I mean, pharmaceutical companies have made a killing. And then later, and so whether it's a placebo, you call it a placebo, but not only is it a placebo, you can then say that certain kind of care regimes, you can then say that this particular care regime of vitamins and placebos is a real mumbo jumbo. It's a real mumbo jumbo because now people are saying that one of the reasons why we had mucormycosis, or whatever it's called, that fungal infection, is because of an excessive consumption of zinc. Right? Which means without any, I don't know if any of this is true, but there are all kinds of theories being bandied about. And you know, there's a, so we need to, sifting through all this is going to take time. We need the dust to settle. And only after the dust settles, we'll be able to actually assess all the strange things that we did in the last 2 years and which we are still doing on what it means, what it could mean, and what we should have done and what we shouldn't have done. Right.
Thank you. Those are wise words, Harish. Absolutely. And I think, you know, once the dust settles, having people like you kind of, you know, really help us make sense of these and bring in these kind of different vantage points to really complicate and make us reassess the way in which we think of science and you know, folk theories and you know, alternate epistemologies, as you kind of very, very delightfully introduced us to today. So thank you for your writing, which I have learned immensely from, as I know have so many others. And thank you for your continued engagement in the public sphere in kind of making these historical examples and making your historical research relevant to the present day. I know I learn a lot from it, and thank you for taking the time today to come and speak with us here at the Center for Contemporary South Asia. And I'm sure that this recording will have a fruitful and engaging afterlife in its recorded incarnation on our website. So thank you. I thank you on behalf of Professor Varshni and of, you know, all others here at in Brown and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prerna. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to what you were just saying about how when vaccination went to China, it was embedded in a theory of meridians and acupuncture. I found that fascinating. And if you've written something on that, I'd like to read it. And I think that's, unfortunately, we never got to speak about it, but thank you for flagging that.
No, I look forward to it. I'm in the process of putting together a book prospectus for a major press here. And so, and hopefully finishing the book. I have dates for a book manuscript. So yes, please hold me to this. I look forward to that.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of you all. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace, for all your hard work behind the scenes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.